I still can't comprehend why some people are so confident in themselves that they believe they can create and do anything they want to do. A good friend of mine once told me that such people are fools. Sooner or later, they will pay the price for their sins. I basically agree with this view, but I've slightly accelerated the reckoning process for my abusers. That damn jacket. If I hadn't left it at home, things might have been completely different. My 18-wheeler truck was loaded with cargo, ready to set off on a 600-mile haul. But my jacket was still hanging in the closet at home. My boss was not happy, but he gave me a few more minutes to go home and get it. As I turned on the narrow street, the trailer wheels scraped the curb. The brakes hissed, and I stopped in front of my house. Ah, I thought. That looks like the boss's car parked in my driveway. The truck engine was still running. I rushed through the front door, walked down the hallway, and came to the bedroom I shared with my wife. As I pushed the door open, the room was illuminated by the light, revealing my wife and the boss in an embarrassing position. She was on all fours, unaware of my presence, while he immediately noticed me. A fleeting look of guilt crossed his face. Then he continued his movements with a smile. My hands trembled. I took out the forgotten jacket from the closet. Furious, I yelled at them, "We'll talk later," and stormed out the door, slamming the bedroom and the front door. I headed towards the cab of the Kenworth truck. As I drove through the suburban streets and onto the highway, my anger was still not subsided. Despite the chaos, I managed to regain control of my emotions. However, doubts about whether to go home haunted me. Lost in thought, the truck hit a bump and veered off the road towards an approaching tree trunk. That was the last thing I remember. I believe he was regaining consciousness. A female voice came from afar. I struggled in vain to open my eyes. My limbs were still immobile, and I couldn't feel my legs. Another voice closer to me. I immediately recognized it as my wife Diane's voice, whispering, "Thank God." Other voices joined in. I felt hands touching my face. "Good morning, Mr. Hammond. I'm glad to see you're awake again. How are you feeling?" A commanding male voice echoed. Despite my attempts to speak, the words did not form. After a great effort, I managed to open my eyes. The room was brightly lit. I recognized several figures moving around, although I couldn't clearly make them out. "Mr. Hammond, you've had an accident. You are currently in the hospital. Please do not try to move. You have multiple fractures. We've kept you in an induced coma for 14 days, while we work to stabilize you. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand. I think I'll blink again." "Good, now we need to focus on your recovery. It will be a gradual process, but we will help you get back on your feet." I was overwhelmed by exhaustion and drowsiness. I closed my eyes and entered the realm of dreams again. When I opened my eyes again, the passage of time was uncertain. My vision cleared. I looked around, noticing various tubes connected to my body. I slightly turned my head and caught a glimpse of someone next to me. My wife was sitting in a chair in the corner, intently reading a book. Feeling my movement, she quickly abandoned her reading and rushed to my bedside. "Steve," she began to speak, her voice filled with relief. "I'm so glad you're awake. I was worried we had lost you. How are you feeling?" I found the question a bit. After being in a coma for weeks, how could I express my condition? Before I could respond, I found that I still couldn't speak. She gently touched my forehead, then returned to her seat. Her expression was a mixture of emotions I couldn't understand. It was sympathy, anger, sympathy, guilt. I watched her until she turned away, confirming my guilt and suspicion. I struggled to understand my thoughts. Memories of the accident flashed through my mind. Why was I in such a hurry to leave the house? The effort to prove it was overwhelming. I lost consciousness again. Undoubtedly, the drugs helped, making my senses dull. When I woke up again, the room was shrouded in darkness. The chair was replaced by a makeshift bed. Diane was asleep, covered with a thin hospital blanket. As my thoughts wandered, they gradually coalesced. Memories came flooding back. Picking up my truck from the warehouse. Realizing my jacket was still at home. Rushing into my bedroom to find my wife and my company boss together. Everything started to make sense. I tried to speak. "You traitor," I wanted to shout. What came out from my lips was almost a sound. But it was enough to wake Diane. She hurried from her bed to my side. I shrank back when she reached out to touch my face. Trying to turn away. I hoped my eyes conveyed the anger I felt. 4 days. I was still heavily medicated to control the pain. In addition to my leg fractures, I also suffered from an unchecked back injury. My truck was written off. But fortunately, a following car reported the accident in time. The ambulance arrived quickly. The doctor began to outline my injuries and the recovery plan ahead. In all of this, a constant visitor in my room was my cheating wife. Diane, my ability to speak returned. What should I say to my wife? A nurse caught a rare moment. When Diane slipped out to use the bathroom, commented. She had never seen a more loyal wife. Diane had been by my side since shortly after I was admitted to the hospital, firmly refusing to leave. I chose not to shatter her illusion. Once Diane returned, and the nurse left, I decided to seek some answers. "How long, Diane?" She turned to me, surprised. "They suspect you fell asleep while driving," she cautiously guessed. "They expect your recovery to take several months." "That's not what I wanted to ask, I retorted. Of course, I didn't fall asleep while driving. But something made my truck veer off the road. Now, how about you and my boss? How long have you been seeing someone behind my back?" "Steve, I really don't want to discuss this now. I love you, only you. I'm here to help you recover from this terrible accident." "Well, you might think I'm ungrateful to say that. But the last time I saw you too, you obviously didn't seem to love me." Upon reflection, I also realized, this wasn't the first time you've been together, right? She didn't need to respond. Her face clearly wrote guilt. She lowered her eyes, avoiding my gaze. "So, how long has my unfaithful Diane been like this?" "Steve, I really don't want to discuss this." "So, do you want a divorce?" "Oh, my God, Steve. Please believe me when I say I love you, only you. I want to have your child. I want to grow old with you." "That doesn't seem very likely now, Diane. You've betrayed our wedding vows. Remember, we promised to be faithful to each other until death do us part." "Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you by surviving the car accident. But it seems you couldn't wait for me to die. Anyway, the prospect of us living happily together seems quite bleak. Would you agree?" She recoiled from my sharp words, sat down in the chair, and cried softly, her hands covering her face. "I think you should go home, Diane. You might think I'm ungrateful, because I don't appreciate your loyalty. But every time I see you, all I can imagine is my boss violating you." She cried louder, grabbed her small overnight bag, and stumbled out of my room, into the hospital corridor. I was alone, feeling the pain. As a nurse passed by, she immediately noticed the absence of my wife. I chose not to respond, but asked her to inform my boss that I could receive visitors. He appeared less than an hour later. "I see the truck, Steve. You really are a lucky guy. I can't believe you came out of there alive." "Yes, thank you for coming, Phil. For the past few days, I've been replaying the accident in my mind. although my memory of it is a bit blurry. Something was wrong with the truck. It went out of control, Phil. The steering wheel was ripped from my hands. The whole setup just veered off the road after hitting a bump. Has the truck been checked? No. Everyone says you fell asleep. Phil, can you go talk to the workshop foreman? Ask him to check the wreckage. See if he can find anything. That might have caused me to veer off the road. I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. But Phil agreed to talk to the people in the workshop. We chatted about various topics. Until he finally got to the main issue. I thought Dade might be with you. Has she been? He asked cautiously. She just left. Why do you ask? No particular reason, Steve. Just thought she would be here. He shifted his feet uncomfortably. Then made an excuse and left. I suddenly realized that Diane's affair with the boss might not have been as discreet as she thought. The next day I was visited by two colleagues. One was the workshop foreman, George Lambert. With him was the union representative, a stern Scot named Jack McGregor. Both seemed unhappy. Mac took over. Steve, we have a problem. I brought George to explain. But your accident was inevitable. I've already initiated the inspection process and cleared every tractor in the fleet. Before the next operation. Management is furious. Because many deliveries will be delayed. Some customers have already threatened to switch carriers. If we let them down. Look at your tractor workshop log, Steve. George said, handing me the greasy hardcover log of my damaged tractor. The last page, filled out on the day of my accident, had a prominent note about a broken spring on the front axle. Go back one page, Mac instructed. I turned to that page. Among the discussion of uneven tire wear, I found an almost identical note about a broken spring leaf. The same comments were on the previous page. Going back 3 weeks, I noticed that every time the truck was serviced, the broken spring was mentioned. Dan, George, why didn't you replace it? I exclaimed. Management didn't allow me to delay the truck. I had the replacement ready in the shop 2 weeks ago. But they refused to let me take the vehicle off the road. Because they were too busy. They kept saying they would fix it at the next service. George explained. No one thought to inform me, I questioned. I'm sorry, Steve. The boss thought it was a minor issue. So I didn't think of it until after the accident. I'm really sorry. It's my fault you got hurt, George apologized. Bullshit, Mac muttered. They knew the risks, gambling with your life. I contacted our legal team today. They have assigned Tim Delaney to handle your case. This guy is a real fighter, Steve. We need to address this issue on 2 fronts. Get you compensation for medical expenses, rehabilitation and lost wages, and the possibility of a package. Because of your back injury, you may not be able to drive professionally anymore. Mac's blunt words hit me. I hadn't even considered the possibility of not going back to work. I lay in bed, closed my eyes. Don't worry, Steve. Focus on getting better, looking forward. We have your back, Mac comforted me. Watching them leave my hospital room, a tear slid down my cheek. It made sense to feel depressed. In a few weeks, I crashed my truck. Was in a coma. And now facing the reality of losing not only my wife, but also my job. The next day Tim Delaney walked into my room with vigor. He was an impressive figure. Probably in his early 40s. Over 6 feet tall. With a physique that suggested he might have been a professional basketball player. We reviewed the accident workshop report. Then discussed future options. You started studying for a business degree 2 years ago, he commented. What made you give that up? To make a living as a truck driver? I grinned. My father was a long-haul truck driver. He often took me with him during my school years. So, it might not seem like a huge change to you. There was another reason too. I met a wonderful girl. We couldn't wait to get married. No, she wasn't pregnant. We just loved each other deeply. Changing jobs allowed us to be together. Touching story, Steve. But I heard things between you two might not be going so well. Damn, am I the last person in the state to find out? My wife is cheating. With my boss, and yours too. Tim responded incredulously. I'm looking forward to tearing him apart in court. I no longer care about him. But I need you to start preparing divorce papers as soon as possible. Tim was excellent. In our brief interaction, I deeply trusted him. He exuded compassion, energy, and a strong sense of integrity. This brought me hope and comfort. He carefully outlined his strategy for legal action against my employer and assured me of expert advice when I separated from Diane. For the first time since the accident, a glimmer of optimism quietly entered my mind. Days passed, I started physical therapy and had medical examinations, including an MRI scan, to formulate a plan to treat my painful back. When an unexpected visitor entered my room and asked to confirm my identity, I immediately became vigilant. He handed me a small envelope, seemingly ready to ask for a signature, before noticing the various tubes connected to me, prompting him to quietly retreat. "Sir, have a nice day," he muttered as he left the room, disappearing into anonymity. I called a nurse to open the envelope and tell me the contents. She complied, but turned pale after reading. "This is your company's termination notice," she whispered. "How could they do this to you while you're still in the hospital?" I asked her to call Tim on my behalf and read the letter to him. As expected, he was by my side within minutes, furious at this cold-heartedness. "This letter will cost the bastard dearly," he vowed. It basically eliminated the need for us to argue in court about your ability to continue in your chosen profession. He solved for us his indifferent and calculated handling of an employee in the hospital, recovering from a work-related injury, will not win him any favor either. What was originally a typical day on the road to recovery turned from despair to optimism. Tim has a gift for filling my mind with positive thoughts about the future. "Oh, by the way," he added as he left, "your wife received the divorce papers today. Diane has not been back since she left in tears. But she entered my room after dinner, obviously very angry. 'How could you do this to me?' she cried. 'I don't want a divorce. I made a mistake, Steve. A mistake, but I love you. I hope we can be together and work this out.' I was more prepared for this confrontation. 'Diane, your way of expressing love is strange. Witnessing the destruction of our marriage is painful enough. But it seems I am the last to know what really happened. Now it is clear that every time I go on a long trip, it marks another date with my boss. I have asked you before about the extent of your affair. You evaded the question. But now it doesn't matter, Diane. You repeatedly disrespected me, our marriage vows. Did I ever refuse you, Steve? Is this your defense?" I asked incredulously. "To be honest, Diane, I expected more from you. How many times have you two been together since my accident?" She averted her gaze, silent. I wondered, does her silence mean they haven't been together at all? Is there still hope? "Our marriage has been good up until now," I reminded her. "Let's not tarnish our good memories with anger and deceit. We will eventually have to discuss the division of our assets. But now is not the time. Go home, Diane. If he brings you happiness, file for divorce and be with him. But don't expect me to be your life partner again. I can't look at you without recalling that moment when I caught you with him. There is no way to get over that hurdle. Goodbye, Dien. I wish you a happy life. She left my ward in tears once again. This time I hope it's the last time. At first, my limbs recovered. I moved around the ward with a cast. I underwent physiotherapy several times a day. However, my back was severely injured, requiring a metal plate to stabilize several vertebrae. A delicate surgery lasted for several hours, followed by a very difficult recovery process, constantly accompanied by pain until I was finally discharged, relying on painkillers to sustain me. Meanwhile, Tim Delaney actively took legal action against the transport company, exploring every legal avenue. Although initially hoping to reach a settlement before trial, I still found myself in court when Tim presented his case to the judge. By the end of the day, the witness testimonies overwhelmingly supported Tim, weakening the company's defense. Before the start of the second day, the company's lawyers tried to settle out of court. My goal is to make the biggest impact. As we entered the negotiation room, Tim said loudly, "They've lost, they know it. Now they're just trying to limit the consequences." True to his promise, Tim issued a challenge, insisting on at least $10 million in damages. He emphasized my ongoing medical expenses, ongoing back pain, and the uncertainty of retraining for a new profession. Surprisingly, even I began to sympathize with my plight. The negotiation had to be completed before the court resumed. At 11 in the morning, it was in our favor. When the defense offered $5 million, Tim frowned on the surface, hiding a victorious gotcha, knowing we might settle for half of his initial demand of $10 million. In their offer, in the end, he succeeded, relentlessly pushing them until both sides agreed. $8.5 million. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was the first time I had seen my boss since the accident. I observed with a certain satisfaction his obvious anger at being forced into this situation, and his inability to look me in the eye. With the legal affairs settled, I made my last visit to the station to say goodbye to my colleagues. George, whose detailed records highlighted the company's negligence, and Jack, who tirelessly advocated for my fair treatment. It was time for me to reorganize and plan for the future. I chose to move to my parents' hometown, where I had studied, and resume my education, hoping to secure an administrative position. I bought a 2-bedroom apartment near the university, and a small hatchback for transportation. Returning to academia was an interesting experience. I found myself a decade older than most people in my group, but also more motivated. Success became a real aspiration. My parents were excited about the new arrangement. I made sure to visit them every weekend, either taking my dad to a football game, occasionally fishing in the bay. We often dined together at restaurants. Although Dien did not sign the divorce papers, she seemed to be dealing with the mortgage and utilities. So I decided not to push the issue, preferably avoiding conflict in life. Following Tim Delaney's advice, I had him arrange for a security company to install several security cameras in our house until our divorce was finalized. He thought it was prudent to monitor the property without having to check in person. A few years later, I graduated with honors, looking for a stable, long-term job. I ended up at an accounting firm in the city center, specializing in corporate bankruptcy management. Their approach was mostly innovative. Rather than resorting to bankruptcy immediately, their main goal was to assess operations and try to restore profitability, sometimes involving sacrifices from creditors. I found this work fulfilling. As part of a small team of experienced professionals, I conducted forensic examinations of various companies to identify weaknesses and work with key personnel to develop turnaround strategies. Soon my talents were recognized in identifying company weaknesses and developing effective solutions. At the end of my staff function, partners and my colleagues acknowledged my contributions. I was entrusted to lead my own team, as well as a significant raise. When a new task arrived on my desk in the morning, I was surprised. The financially troubled company was none other than my former employer. Recognizing the potential conflict of interest, I immediately called the senior partner and asked to be excused from the case. His response was straightforward. "Steve, we are aware of your previous connections with this company. In fact, this makes you the ideal candidate. You still have former colleagues who rely on this company for a living. It provides you with an additional motive to help them out of this situation. Moreover, I have confidence in your professionalism." My first task was to inform my old boss that our company had been appointed, and I would lead the management team. He kept talking about how unfair all this was, claiming there were no major issues, just a small cash flow, a minor problem that had already been resolved. Our intervention would be a complete waste of time. I politely mentioned. The intervention was authorized by the court. Our team had been assigned to conduct an investigation. I told him we would arrive with my team at 9 o'clock the next morning, and thanked him in advance for his cooperation. I ended the call. It became immediately obvious after we arrived. The staff had been instructed to provide as little information as possible, because they were constantly hindering our progress. This response from the management was not unexpected. To us, we represented their failure to effectively manage their own business. In the morning, I briefly discussed the issue with Jack and George over coffee. After a group discussion with my team at lunchtime, I made a decision. I knocked on the boss's door, went in and suggested that if he left the premises, it might be less embarrassing for my team to continue our work. At first, he outright rejected the idea. But when he realized I could request he be forcibly evicted, he reluctantly agreed and left like a disgruntled child. It took me 2 days to identify the issues. A young member of our team, a petite blonde girl who looked no older than 16, fresh out of business school, came to me with a ledger of creditors. This driver was employed by the company and regularly paid for long-distance, cross-state trips. However, I checked. The same truck could not be found on any freight list. So what was it really used for? Who was paying the bills, she asked. Thanking her for her keen observation, I requested copies of the invoices. The phenomenon of ghost operators is a classic tactic of transport companies. They use subcontracted vehicles, usually discovered when members of the accounting team never take a vacation, diligently trying to conceal their actions. However, it's not the case here. When reviewing the invoices, it became obvious. Each one was personally approved by the boss. Summoning the administrative manager, I asked if the company had provided a laptop for the boss. Absolutely, he replied enthusiastically. We bought 4 Dell laptops about a year ago. The boss has the highest configuration model among them. If you wish, I can provide the invoice. I smiled inwardly and noted down the serial number of the boss's computer. My next step was to contact the local sheriff for help. I needed to retrieve company equipment from a manager's home. I suspected he wouldn't willingly hand it over. The laptop, which might contain information crucial to our investigation of his company. I explained to the sheriff. Though he wasn't very enthusiastic, he agreed to pick me up from the warehouse office in 15 minutes. On the drive, he began to ask me, "Have you worked for this organization before, right?" He asked. Yes, I confirmed. Remember that terrible accident? Had to deal with the wreckage recovery. You were lucky to get out alive, he commented. Yes, indeed. But things will eventually get resolved, I replied. Did you leave your wife when you moved? He continued to ask. That's correct, I answered thoughtfully. Is that guy still with her? I don't know, Sheriff. I filed for divorce when I left. It hasn't been finalized yet. But currently, I'm not in a romantic relationship. Frankly, I don't care who she's with. I explained, I thought she was alone at night. He visited during the day. He's married with kids, goes home every night. His wife might be the only one. Who doesn't know what's going on? The sheriff commented. Then we're both the same. I retorted bitterly. I had no idea at all. Until I stumbled upon them in action. That was the day of the accident. We agreed. The sheriff would allow me to request the laptop and intervene if necessary. As expected, it was necessary. At first he tried to pass off an old, different brand laptop. But when he realized I had the make and serial number of the unit we were looking for, and saw the sheriff approaching from the police car, he reluctantly handed it over. Promised to return it within 24 hours. I expected he might be right. I asked the sheriff to drop me back at the office, where I gathered my team. A member was assigned to immediately download the entire content of the laptop to our secure server. This precaution would allow us to comply with any court order demanding its return, while maintaining a hidden, automatic forwarding feature to monitor any subsequent activity. As expected, a young lawyer, probably not familiar with this industry, came to demand the immediate return of the laptop. We initially argued that the laptop belonged to the company, not his client, but in the end gave in. He had the power to possess it. Before the lawyer arrived, the laptop had been carefully placed back in its shell. Gave the impression that it had not been tampered with by me or my team. The lawyer, with a sense of victory, eagerly took over it, jumped back to his car. Meanwhile, my IT team was checking the content downloaded from the laptop. Their task was simplified due to the scarcity of passwords and the surprisingly easy access to all areas. We focused on bank records and found a series of transactions spanned over several years. The amount and frequency are gradually increasing. It became obvious. Our target transferred a large amount of money through fraudulent invoices. These invoices passed through the system because of his approval. Our next goal is to trace the flow of funds. The initial payment was directed to a bank account in the name of a ghost contractor, naturally controlled by the company's boss. The account only maintained a nominal balance, indicating that the funds are being redirected elsewhere to avoid being discovered. By deciphering the code in the downloaded files, we managed to find some accounts where the money was hidden. These accounts are scattered in different countries, in different names. It's time to seek the expertise of Tim Delaney, lawyer. He successfully handled my compensation case. He is still in the same company and has been promoted to partner since we last met. He looked very happy to see me and eagerly looking forward to taking legal action against my former boss. After a few days of intense meetings with regulatory agencies and law enforcement agencies, we concluded that it was necessary for the police to immediately bring charges of embezzlement and seek immediate imprisonment without bail to prevent the defendant from fleeing the country. On the day James Seward was arrested, I was in the transportation company's office. Received a visitor. "Steve, there is a Miss Seward at the reception waiting for you." The young receptionist informed me. "Okay, let her in." I expected this meeting to be interesting. The woman who entered my temporary office, in fact, the boss's office I took over in his absence, was stunning. She was blonde, well-proportioned, impeccably dressed, exuding elegance. Extended her hand to shake hands. She sat gracefully in the visitor's chair opposite my desk. After a surprisingly firm grip, "Mr. Hammond, I am the spouse of James Seward. Yes, I guessed it. I realize you played a role in my husband's imprisonment. This might be an overstatement, Mrs. Seward. We have evidence indicating that your husband illegally transferred a large amount of funds from his own company, endangering its future. Due to the risk of flight, he has been detained awaiting trial. So actually, Mrs. Seward, it is your husband's actions that led to his imprisonment, not mine. What do you know about the ownership of the company, Mr. Hammond? Only 2 shares recorded in the company records, held by you and your husband respectively. But you already knew. Why do you ask? Mr. Hammond, I believe if I mention my maiden name, you will immediately recognize my family. We were early investors of this company and heavily funded its growth through loans provided by my family. Although, as you said, there are 2 shares, but all the capital of the company was provided by my family. If the company fails, my husband will lose the 1 share initially given to him. He demonstrated the ability to manage the company in the early stage. I still believe in his ability. Our initial review of the company's structure. The situation is becoming more and more complex. We noticed a large number of loans from a single investor, but we have not yet linked it to Seward's wife. Mrs. Seward, I sighed. No disrespect intended to your husband. Our investigation indicates he has not been completely honest with you. This will be considered by the court in the coming weeks. We have taken legal action to prevent him from accessing any affairs of the company. In addition, we have assured the employees that the organization may get out of financial trouble through transactions. Our findings indicate it should be able to operate profitably. Its current unstable state is the result of illegal activities. Details I cannot disclose. But I assure you, we will not leave until we are confident in ensuring its future or, if necessary, liquidating its assets. The elegant lady nodded, stood up from her seat, thanked me, then left the office gracefully, leaving behind a trace of her perfume. When the time came for the court to convene, we had all the necessary evidence ready. We not only understood how Seward used fictitious contractors to transfer funds, and moreover, precisely knowing when and where these funds were transferred. His motive remains a mystery, because the embezzled funds seem not to have been spent. In court, our lawyer Tim Delaney systematically dismantled Seward's defense. Initially, Seward tried to evade direct questions. Apparently, he had no idea how extensive the information we had gathered was. What he didn't know was Tim Delaney had installed security cameras, a detail he has not mentioned since the installation. When Seward was brought back to the witness stand, he struggled to respond. A series of financial issues. Then Delaney suddenly changed direction. Mr. Seward, he began to naively ask, "Are you familiar with Mrs. Deanne Hammond?" "Yes," he replied, visibly pale. "Can you elaborate on your relationship with Mrs. Hammond?" "Of course, she is the spouse of one of my former drivers. We occasionally meet at company gatherings. Is there anything else you'd like to reveal about your association with Mrs. Hammond?" Feeling uneasy, increasingly frustrated with Tim Delaney's inquiry, he replied, "I have no personal relationship with Mrs. Hammond. As I mentioned, she is the wife of a former employee, currently investigating my company." "Have you engaged in sexual activity with Mrs. Hammond?" "Absolutely not," he immediately replied. "Your Honor, I request this witness be excused, to possibly be recalled later, and call Mr. Brian Smith to the stand." Permission granted. A burly individual, around 40 years old, somewhat heavier than recommended, casually walked to the witness stand and was formally sworn in. "Mr. Smith, could you please state your full name and occupation to the court?" "Brian James Smith. I am a security consultant for ABC Security. Could you please inform the court of the assignment I gave you 2 years ago on April 19th? To install 5 security cameras at the residence owned by Mr. Steve Hammond and his wife. Are these cameras still operational, Mr. Smith? Yes, sir, their footage automatically transferred to our server every 24 hours. Who is responsible for monitoring these surveillance videos? Mr. Smith. No one has reviewed them until yesterday when you asked to see them. With the court's permission, I would like to present 5 photographs. May I proceed? The judge nodded in approval. Delaney dramatically handed the first photo to the witness. The witness checked it expressionlessly. Can you identify the individuals in the photo? And describe as much as possible the location where the photo was taken. Of course. The man in the photo is the defendant, James Seward. I am not familiar with the woman in the photo, but she is sitting in the gallery. He pointed out Diane. She tried to shrink into her seat. Can you describe what the individuals in the photo were doing at the time? Well, they were engaging in sexual activity. Intercourse. Yes, sir, Your Honor. I have 4 more photos, taken at different times over the past few weeks, from the home security cameras. I would like to submit them as evidence to the court. I also have an affidavit from Mr. Smith, confirming the authenticity of the photos and the placement of the security cameras. Your Honor, I would like to request Mr. Seward be recalled to the witness stand. The man was thoroughly struck. He admitted the fact. He turned his gaze to the floor when further questions were raised, eventually admitting to perjury. Once the litigation with Seward was over, the court adjourned until the next day. When it reconvened the next day, the judge quickly dealt with the issue, finding Seward guilty of embezzlement, amounting to millions of dollars, and perjury. The judge also noted potential allegations of improper relations with Seward, related to an employee's spouse. The sentencing was postponed for a few weeks. Let us be satisfied with the results of our efforts. Obtained information on overseas financial institutions and account details. Most of the funds are recoverable. Met with Phil George Jock and other senior staff at the transportation terminal. It was a pleasure, because we assured them the missing funds have been found, outstanding debts have been settled, and the court has allowed normal trading activities to resume. Phil is ready to take on the CEO position. With the support of his dedicated team, the company is expected to prosper again. Ownership is now firmly in the hands of Seward's wife. During their difficult times, she has proven herself to be a staunch supporter. A few days later, during dinner with Tim Delaney, Diane came to our table. I stood up to greet her and invited her to join us. As we had just placed our order, I immediately signaled the waiter to note Diane's drink and food preferences. She seemed obviously uncomfortable in our company. Tim Delaney seemed not very happy to have her here either. I apologize for invading your privacy, she began to say. But when I learned you were having dinner here, I realized we should have had a conversation a long time ago. So here I am. What are you thinking, Diane? By now you must know. James and I plan to leave the country together, to start a new life abroad. James has been hinting that he will soon have the means to support us living together, but he never revealed how. When the company went bankrupt, I was shocked, because I believed it was thriving. I was even more shocked to learn in court. My partner, I'm sorry Steve, but he has been my partner for years, planned to fund our life together by embezzling funds from his own company. Now is not the right time or place for this conversation. I began to indicate discomfort with Tim Delaney. Maybe we can discuss it another time. No need to talk, Steve. I foolishly threw away your love so recklessly. And even more foolishly, thought our relationship was serious. When I knew that James has always been with his wife. I suspect I was never more than a secret affair in his heart. When we first started dating, you were away on business. But gradually, I let myself believe I fell in love with him. Obviously, according to the amount he managed to hide. Over the past few years, he must have felt something for me too. But that's not why I'm here now. You previously gave me divorce papers. Steve, I finally have to accept. Our marriage has no chance of survival. She rummaged through her purse and took out a crumpled piece of paper. This is the divorce petition, Steve. Signed without any conditions. You are officially rid of me. We need to discuss the house. But I won't make any more demands. Considering I was the one who first broke our relationship. Thanks for the dinner invitation. But suddenly I have no appetite. Good night, she hurriedly stood up, trying to hide the tears, and then hurriedly left. Well, that was unexpected. I said to Tim Delaney with a smile. Now maybe we can enjoy our dinner. About a month later, the court reconvened for the sentencing hearing. So Tim Delaney and I chose to attend. To our surprise, Diane was also in the gallery, wearing a conservative suit, looking very nice. The judgment was short. The judge read out the charges and guilty verdicts. Long prison sentences for each crime, totaling more than 20 years. But considering the time served, Seward will be eligible for parole in 9 years and 7 months. When he looked up and saw me, noticing the relief on my face, he made what might have been a you-jerk expression. But I was satisfied. The cunning man who stole my wife, finally facing the consequences. In 3 months, he lost his hidden wealth, his wife, his business, and his mistress. As he was escorted to begin serving his sentence, I gave him my brightest smile. Only then, noticed the woman who was about to become Seward's ex-wife in the gallery. She smiled at me as we crossed near the exit. Followed her for a few steps. I heard every word. As my ex-wife Diane stood by. I would be happy, I replied with a smile. Diane stuttered in disbelief and quickly averted her gaze. The woman took my arm I offered. We strolled leisurely towards a quiet restaurant near the courthouse. After years of pain, embarrassment, and disappointment, I am finally optimistic about what the future may bring. Thank you to everyone who took the time to listen to today's story. If you like, please consider liking and subscribing. If you haven't, feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.